geographer, working on environmental governance, geographies of conservation, and indigenous studies with a regional focus on Southeast Asia, mainly in Borneo, and more recently in Australia through her long-term connections with the Bawaka Collective. Her research uses a decolonial political ecology approach to understand how neo-colonial conservation processes shape environmental governance institutions, power knowledge dynamics, human-environment relations, and how different groups respond to these transformations. She is a postdoctoral fellow in Indigenous Environmental Studies at the University of Sydney's Environment Institute and Department of Geosciences, a member of the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures, or IFFF, and several academic collectives seeking to reimagine new futures in academia and beyond. She holds a Master of Science in Environmental Change and Management, and also a Doctor in Philosophy in Geography and Environment from the University of Oxford. On a personal note, June and I are members of the Not Lone Wolf Collective, composed of academics and researchers from who are based around the world, but mainly based right now geographically in Australia, Malaysia, the UK, Portugal, and the Philippines. It seeks to question heteronormative and hegemonic orthodoxies in academia and in research practice. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. June Rubis.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I had a video, so I don't know whether, great.
Yeah, it's coming. Yeah, it's right here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here and to be giving this plenary talk to you today. And I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Joseph Palace, for inviting me to speak to you today. My name is June Rubis. I am with the Sydney Environment Institute, University of Sydney, and I'm a Bidayuh woman from Malaysian Borneo, Sarawak. I understand that the theme for this year's conference is centered around geographies of care. So therefore, I'd like to talk about my research that provokes the idea of care around the more than human, in this case, orangutan conservation, and also humans in the sense of centering indigenous peoples' governance systems and practices in my research. So my talk today demonstrates how complex human orangutan relations persist, in spite of neo-colonial conservation enclosures which seek to securitize orangutans as biodiversity and control humans as a threat thereto. My talk is based on an article I recently published in the Journal of Cultural Studies. Through analysis of indigenous naming practices, knowledges, and narratives, I advocate for relating to orangutans not as objects to protect, but instead as beings to coexist with. This, I propose, is what it takes to sustain, to care for wild orangutans as more than an abstracted species with conservation value. Now, I'd like to set the scene to where this research is premised upon. For several decades, there have been large-scale deforestation, encroachment on indigenous territories in Sarawak, Malaysia, and Borneo. So the idea of rural poverty and being left behind has led to Sarawak's quest to accelerate land development over the 40 years. So this meant the vast transformation of Sweden farming subsistence to intensive rural development of large-scale cash crop plantations and modern infrastructure, including roads, electricity, and pipe water. And further, rural natives are constantly pressured to participate in the market economy through large-scale commercial plantation agriculture. So with state aspirations to develop land for agriculture and other mega industries, this has led to conserve the remaining lands for forestry and wildlife conservation purposes. So the dream of development has become a nightmare for many rural native communities, producing labor exploitation and land tenure insecurity, including because of the creation of protected areas. So particularly in conservation literature, rural native peoples of Borneo are often written off as unruly and represent a constant threat to nature and wildlife, and therefore have to be managed in different ways. So the onset for this research began a long time ago in the 2000s when I finished with my biology degree and I started working for an international conservation NGO as a conservation field worker. So I commenced on the first long-term nest count surveys to survey wild orangutans in Sarawak. And in addition to my day job as a conservation biologist, I was also volunteering full-time in the local nature society. So this experience meant I had an opportunity to work closely with state forestry actors and other NGOs, and I therefore gained a richer understanding of social environmental issues beyond my fieldwork. And it was through these interactions, particularly with Indigenous land rights activists around Borneo and my own subsequent work as an activist in a major anti-Magadam campaign in Sarawak, that I began to question my own assumptions of local Indigenous communities and how we as conservation NGO workers were working with them. And I also like to mention, also watching my family, my dad, he was a Dai traditional priest before he passed away, and he very much worked with us with our local communities back in the village, and very much supported like the the rights to revitalize our cultural traditions in terms of rituals, not just in Sarawak but also West Kalimantan. So I was also really inspired by my family's work, of my dad and my sisters, who have continually worked on Indigenous issues, both locally and also globally, for my sister. So from the Latin Pongo, an anthropoid ape, and Pygmaeus, a short and reduced stature, the Mayas, which is what they once called orangutans, are known as Pongo pygmaeus in the scientific world, or more commonly as the orangutan. For many familiar with the Indo-Malay region, it is often assumed that orangutan is a term that locals use to know and name the great ape, right? I mean, it's derived from Malay words, orang from person, and utan for forest. So put them together and you have person of the forest. It's quite poetic. However, as the Mayas, which is what the Ibans call the orangutans, are also found in regions where Iban people, they are one of the major indigenous groups in Sarawak and also rest of Kalimantan, have lived and thrived for at least 400 years. So Ibans, of course, naturally have their own terms to identify and acknowledge the Mayas. So they didn't call them orangutan, they called them the Mayas. So this non-indigenous origin of the term orangutan is little known outside the Mayas or Mawas habitats of Sumatra and Borneo. So in Sarawak, the orangutan is known as Mayas in its many variants that depends on its characteristics. And in Sumatra and other parts of Borneo, the orangutan is known as the Mawas. So there is no literary record of the Malay-speaking peoples using the term orangutan or one of its variants to refer to the ape before the middle of the 19th century. So the first recorded Malay use of the term resembling orangutan to describe the ape identifies the word as a Western term. So the Hikayat Abdullah, which is a major literary work written in the 1840s by Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir, he's a Malaccan-born Munshi from Singapore. He recounts that the ruler Sambas sent Mr. Raffles the present of 2 apes of the kind, which the English called orangutan. So here is a 16th century illustration of an orangutan. By the 17th and 18th centuries, orangutans that were presented to the Western audiences were creatures detached from their natural habitat, both literally and symbolically. And when we think about the Linnaean classification of comparative anatomy, it pays little attention to where the animal came from as it did to its behavior. So the orangutan has loomed larger in the imagination of the West than it did in its native Borneo and Sumatra. So in her seminal Decolonizing methodologies book, Linda W.Y. Smith describes how naming is part of the colonizing methodology, where renaming the land was almost as powerful ideologically as changing the land. Smith thus offers a counter decolonizing methodology to rename the world using original indigenous names and to retain as much control over meanings as possible. By naming the world, people name their realities. So for communities, there are realities which can only be found in indigenous language. The concepts which are self-evident in the indigenous language that can never be captured by another language. I conducted most of my fieldwork in the years of 2015 and 16 in 3 Iban communities in Bataan, Lanchak, and Timah complex. So in this complex, people can live within the complex and they have limited rights. And since the gazetting of the complex, at least 7 communities in Bataan and about 35 communities in Lubuk Antu, they have restricted privileges to hunt, fish, and gather jungle produce in the area for their own personal consumption, and they're not allowed to sell these in the jungle produce, especially the meat. Activities in the park are limited to farming of previously cultivated areas and gathering forest goods. So in return, the communities are said to benefit from employment, such as, to become game wardens and park rangers in the park. And they have formed their own cooperatives that provide transport and accommodation and guiding for visitors that come to the area. So the complex is also part of the Malaysian-Indonesian Transfrontier Protected Area since 1994, and it shares a common border with Batuan Karimun, which is the nature reserve in Indonesia. So together, they form one of the largest transboundary protected area in the wet tropics. So this complex it's really important and vital to conservationists. It comprises nearly 1 million hectares of hilly dipterocarp forests and are considered an important habitat for the Bornean orangutan, the Pongo pygmaeus. So nearly 30 Iban communities within and near the complex have been documented in existence for over 400 years. They also have their own oral stories, traditions that validate this. And today the complex is considered ecologically important by the conservation community because it contains the only population of orangutans remaining in Sarawak. And prior to the gazettement of the complex, the Iban communities have fully exercised their native customary rights in the area without much interruption by the state. However, during my previous fieldwork in the complex in the mid-2000s, my team and I, we discovered 4 orangutan corpses that were shot to death in 1 year alone, sparking a response by the conservation NGO that I work with to focus on working with local communities through what they call re-education programs of perceived lost cultural protocols that include a general taboo on hunting orangutans. So ever since, it's been taken for granted by policymakers and conservation NGOs in the state that the fault remains on the local community level. And such conservation policies and initiatives have since followed this lead. Now, many communities previously living within or near the complex were displaced several decades ago during the gazetting of the protected area after the dam was built, and they've lost most of their rights to access to the complex and encouraged to participate in the government oil palm schemes in rural nearby towns. And this represents a common theme throughout Sarawak and many tropical countries where indigenous and local communities are displaced by plantations and other development from their native territories. So how do we understand the orangutan? Well, when you're trained by the classic Western tradition where nature is in opposition with reason, conservation is generally defined the Mayas within a discursively constructed divide that separates humans from nature, which reveals a relationship of control and domination. Yet the Ibans have categorized and understood the Mayas long before Western or Malaysian biologists had arrived in Bataan. And I learned this categorization of naming the orangutan, the Mayas, early on in my days of conservation fieldwork in the mid-2000s, but it had no place in the research frameworks we were taught to use. So in my interviews with current conservationists, they emphasized their work on environmental education campaigns that they run with the Bataan Longhouse communities, where primary school children are targeted for these campaigns. And these awareness campaigns include Western influence plays with theater prop firearms and orangutan mascots. And now this main objective was to re-educate the rural Iban communities on the protected status of the Mayas and the landscape, and to remind the Ibans of the stories of the Mayas. So the central assumption garnered by the interviews that I did of the conservationists is that Ibans seem to have forgotten their ancestral stories, such as prohibition to kill the Mayas. The truth is, the ban was imposed by a different set of authority, which is the conservation actors, and is not a nuanced expression of Iban adat. So to these conservationists, the Mayas are their utmost priority to protect, and the reason for their presence in Bataan. The conservationists will mention the lack of income as a reason for hunting and explain that the sale of wildlife could be offset by transforming what would be hunters into community patrollers. So one conservationist further explained their motives. Indigenous conservation needs a carrot and a stick. Communities want development. And when the right conditions can exist, conservation could then be facilitated. For example, the enlightened ones understand the negative impact of planting all palm on their lands. So the rational order of conservation practice, it relies on the assumption that education campaigns could correct people's ways, and humans are not seen as part of a healthy ecosystem, and their actions need to be constantly monitored or managed. But on the contrary, I argue that recentering indigenous naming of the Mayas enables practices of being with rather than managing off. So such practice places the Mayas in different relationships with. So there's a particular logic used by conservationists to view Ibans and other indigenous peoples who have continued to live in rural areas as landowners who have lost their way and do not have sufficient knowledge to manage natural resources in the present day for the benefit of conservation. So to many conservationists, Ibans and other rural indigenous and local populations continues to threaten wildlife species with their practices in social life. So they don't necessarily talk about development or like global industries or the global market. It's all about how do we control local populations. And through conservation logic and naming, Iban people, land, more than human beings have become abstracted from their relations and turned into resources or complaints. The Mayas have been categorized into what needs to be protected, totally protected, and why they should be conserved, and thus further disembodied from place and relations with humans. So one example is, for example, the orangutan rehabilitation centers that exist in various parts of Borneo, where these orangutans, for various reasons, have been displaced from environment, but also displaced from relations with local communities. And I am very much interested in the ways of can we conserve water orangutans already in their territories, in their habitat, and also support ongoing relations with local communities who have been existing in the lands for for hundreds of years. So Ibans have categorized the orangutan long before Western explorers had arrived in Borneo. And I learned this categorization early in my days of conservation fieldwork, and I was also taught to dismiss it because it wasn't not considered as important as the scientific data I was going to collect and put into statistical packages. So when I informed my Iban interlocutor that I had cited the Mayas, I always have to clarify to them what type of Mayas is it? Is it a Mayas Kasak? Is it a Mayas Rambay? So this method of classification pays attention to where the orangutan is most likely found and its appearance. And this helps the Ibans keep track of which Mayas is currently in what territories. So for example, the Mayas Kasak is often found in the PLENARY, which is the secondary forest. The others, the Mayas Rambay, the Mayas Gambi, the Mayas Chapan, are usually found in the Hutan Basay and primary forests. And the names denote like the size or like the color of the fur that orangutans have. So for the Ibans of Bataan, the Mayas have been part of the world through interrelations and interdependency for much longer than conservationists had conceived or when they started the programs in Bataan. According to Appay, which is one of my main interlocutors, there are several stories that convey the interspecies relationality of the Bataan Ibans and the Mayas. So one of the main stories that is often repeated also in tourist retellings relates to how several hundreds years ago, Iban women and his ancestor communities were struggling to give birth safely. So the communities had migrated in search of new lands to live on, and they were unfamiliar with the territories. And several Ibans on a scouting expedition, they came across a pregnant Mayas eating a particular ginger plant. So they returned to the village with this new piece of information, and they sought the plant to look for it, and they prepared it for the women in the community who were pregnant. The concoction had helped ease their birthing pains, and since then the Mayas had credited the Ibans had credited the Mayas for this particular plant knowledge. And Inday, Appay's wife, reminds me that up to now, like even up to today, the women in the community who have moved away from the longhouse into the more urban areas for marriage or work still request the ginger plant. We boil the plant and they drink it like tea. So this story and its variants have captured the conservationists and tourist guides' attention, although they have sought to dismantle the story from its epistemological origins and reconfigure it into a moralistic fable. So then we're informed in this new retelling of the story that because of this special connection with Mayas, Ibans have a moral obligation toward orangutan, particularly for conservation. This idea of moral obligation, it works, right? In terms of regulating self-enforcement within communities. So you can have community patrollers, but you don't necessarily pay them because you insist on the story, remind them of the story. So for instance, an education campaign that focuses on the law and consequences of killing the Mayas while simultaneously reminding the communities of their obligation to the orangutan, this assigns greater conservation responsibility and therefore consequences to the communities. So within the Euro-Western frameworks of conservation, where humans are collectively homogenized, as in like the differences between indigenous communities and other non-indigenous communities, they have been flattened to one identity, and colonial structures disregarded. So taking, for example, like science as universal thought and current conservation practices as like the only way. The idea of the more than human species reliance upon humans for survival persists. So for Apay and many other interlocutors, however, the Maya's birth story, along with the customary taboo against killing Mayans and other wildlife species, is part of reciprocal customary adat. So adat is like rules and laws that fixes interspecies connections to land and place. So there is no human divine authority over non-human species, nature, and place. So it's not to say that they see themselves or like other animals or nature and place. So Mayas, the pythons, and other more than human beings alike, they will also hold responsibilities, as do Ibans while living on the same lands. So the Mayas are also expected to uphold their obligation not to kill, not to destroy the farmers' livelihoods or harm Ibans themselves. So we do not shoot to kill, but we shoot to scare the Mayas and other wildlife away from uprooting trees. As such, we begin to appreciate how the agency of the Mayas underpins Iban understandings of the universe. So the stories that are shared with me by Apay explains to me how he sees as the proper ways to be in this world as a Ban, living in his territories, and to maintain good relations and belonging, including with the Ibans. And including with the more human species. But there's a danger, however, to disentangle stories from their place context, and thus critiquing Ibans for not fulfilling their end of the argument. So such a limited extractive engagement misses the potential to understand how a fuller interspecies relationship could exist, and it reinforces problematic relationships. Of course, and also I do not intend to argue that these protocols are observed in constant harmony, nor to paint an idyllic picture of interspecies relations. My interlocutors often convey their complex and urgent realities while balancing these with the expectations of conservation actors and other institutions interested in the land practices and social lives. So perhaps it's the context of relationships of care and to make kin, and this is from Haraway and Kim Talbert, that the politics of naming could perhaps be best understood. So by attending to these relations, we also attend to the responsiveness to how we attend or care, and beyond the imperial modes of constructive care. I therefore argue it is necessary to consider how we approach indigenous naming, knowledges, and stories in conservation work, and also in our citational practices. It is these ideas of knowing the Mayans beyond to protect, and rather to connect in place, that maintains orangutan-human relations as more than an abstracted species with conservation value. So in other words, we must know the Mayas beyond its mostly charismatic and conservation value and carefully think through its embodied correlations with place, any Ibans, or other indigenous peoples living in the same lands. So just to reiterate from my talk, just how can we move away from the status quo of conservation that are also indigenous peoples are benevolent custodians, which is such a romanticized idea of indigenous peoples and does not reflect the reality that they currently live in? How can we decolonize ways of knowing as to support existing indigenous governance and conservation? and also beyond co-management and collaborators, which currently what conservation still pursues in the practices with indigenous communities. Decolonization is not a metaphor, as we're reminded by Tuck and Yang, and relating to orangutans as not as objects to protect, but instead as beings to coexist with. And it's like these attending to these relations, we can also attend to responsiveness of how we attend or care beyond the imperial modes of constructive care. So thank you for listening. And these are some of the selected references from my talk that I was quite inspired with and also mentioned. This is another paper that my talk touches on. It's about concealing protocols, indigenous survivance. So what happens, for example, when indigenous communities and peoples, they have to go along with conservation practices, and they don't necessarily want to damage relations. So we talk about how to conceal these protocols. And you can also find more of my publications if you go on Google Scholar or Academia EDU, June Rubis, and also on Twitter, June Rubis. And thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate you spending the time with me. And I would like to stop it now. And I'm happy to take any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, June. Oh, so wonderful to hear it in another iteration. I heard you speak into other occasions before, intersecting with this wonderful and rich terrain of research that you are engaged with in the last few years. So it's once again another angle to look at conservation and also coexisting with the Mayas, right? At this point, maybe I would like to ask questions from each one. If you have questions for June, also if you can choose to put it in the Zoom chat, that would also be great. There's one right here. June, there's a question for you. How did the state agents respond to the idea of decolonizing the conservation of Mayas?
Thank you, Kelvin. Can you hear me fine, Joseph and everyone?
Yeah, really
Okay.
good.
Great question. And it's a question that makes me nervous as well. They're very much aware of my work. Well, pretty much because we're all ex-colleagues. So they remember me from back of the day. They know my work, but I have not yet, because I haven't been able to spend time in Sarawak because of COVID. So yeah, I feel a bit nervous in some ways because they know my work, and I know they've seen my talks, particularly one of the co-directors of the Sarawak Forestry Corporation. They're very supportive, but they still have to do things their way if that makes any sense. So I'm interested in, like the practicalities of like, would they understand this? But I think my approach is actually more towards conservationists, in a sense, the conservation practitioners, not so much about the state agents, because the state agents don't necessarily play a role in conservation. They may support it, but they don't actively do programs on the ground, as far as I know. Yeah, so so it's a really great question because that's still ongoing. The talks and the negotiation and also me trying to bring my work more into practice.
Thank you, June. I guess the question of Kelvin also has another angle where it tries to look at the tensions of how this kind of conservation coexists, to use your term, with state agents. And obviously, it's far more complicated than having an answer that it's either this or the other, but it's constant transaction or negotiation against, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think like when I talk about like decolonizing ways of knowledge and how we understand, for example, science and nature. I mean, I grew up in Sarawak. I guess like most of you, we grew up in Southeast Asia. So it was very much like the rural to urban, like transition. So you're taught like, like science and, like you're taught to dismiss like the ways, the stories of our ancestors and our grandparents. you know, we never really took it seriously. I mean, for myself, I never really did until you become an adult and then you realize all these issues that are entangled with this. So it's still such a process. So I guess my way of approaching this is through like public talks and like trying to change mindsets of like local Malaysians, local Southeast Asians to reconsider like how do we, yeah, considered like the stories and like the stories and experiences of rural communities that we're often taught to dismiss because, you know, like we're taught that we know better and they don't. And so therefore we have to educate them. So I'm very much interested in that angle as well. So decolonize our minds first before we start to
All right,
decolonize others.
before we wait for another question from someone, I do have to ask you this, Jun. How was your experience when you've written that article where you said something about orangutan is not an indigenous name,
Yeah.
and in a sense trying to recenter Mayas uh, as a way to recover and retrieve certain kinds of histories from this species?
I have given a similar talk years ago, actually in Kuching, in International Biological Conservation Conference. So actually, yes, they have heard my work, the state agents and also a lot of people, and I talk about centering the Mayas. So I had different reactions. Of course, the social scientists are always really happy when you bring it. You know, they're happy and they recognize the importance of respecting indigenous and local namings of species. um, but I feel like there's still a disconnect, and I don't know why that is myself. But also perhaps because it also took myself a long journey just to get here. So maybe it's still a journey for others, where they feel like they do respect the names, but they still have to do certain types of like projects and programs because that's what the funders want. So for
Mhm.
example, when I talk about education programs, because the reality is the hunters were actually from urban areas. And even though the local communities were helping like the hunt, they were brought in like, you know, like for assistance. So this is the stories I heard, but the actual hunters came from the urban areas. So actually we should be educating urban people like ourselves, not so much like the rural communities. But when you talk about education programs in the longhouses, I think it's very appealing because it makes such a visual impact for like funders when you take photos and when you talk about working with rural communities. But I think when we think about conservation, like the work is actually really boring. It's like in you know, like in the city, it's like in, you know, rooms, like meeting rooms. It's like, you know, talking to people with power because they're the ones like implementing projects on the ground of development and infrastructure. But you know, it's very politically like sensitive. So that's why conservationists, I mean, I understand it from a sensitive issue. They find it easier to support. I mean, it's easier to target local communities, and we've always taken for granted. And I suppose it's sort of my way of saying to conservationists, can we do things differently? How can we incorporate like the naming of Mayas in terms of how we do the work and in our practices, and just recognize like the meaningful, like the connections and relations that local communities have with not just orangutans, but like other conservationists, conserve species of conservation value. You know, just like how do we turn that dynamic? And I think that's still ongoing. But I think the
Right.
more people are, when they become receptive, I think the ground starts to shift. And yeah, and so I find there's been growing support with Malaysians, but not so much to shift like, you know, like programs and such.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, are there any other questions? I do have one more question actually that I sort of wanted to ask you
Yeah,
personally too, but I do want to acknowledge if there are some questions or anyone who would like to use the microphone to ask questions to June, just raise your hand. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Well, let me ask this question to you, June, because it has intrigued me, especially since there was a discussion much early, not for this conference, but in another one. I think with my own students, actually. I forgot where the setting was, where we talk about toponymy. or the naming of places. And you mentioned that naming is quite a colonizing methodology as well. And it's something that I heard, but not as much explained to me in some ways. Could you share your thoughts a little bit more about that statement that you made,
So that, yeah,
especially
the
naming as
naming of
colonizing?
places. So I got that from Linda Tuhiwai Smith. If you are familiar with decolonial scholarship, that name should be familiar with you. To you, she's a Maori scholar, and she wrote this really seminal work called Decolonizing Methodologies. And she talks about when you rename places, like you change the place, you change the relationships of place. And I guess we can understand it. I'm trying to think of an example in Southeast Asia, but other examples like in settled colonial places, they change the names to like settler names. And in some ways, it changes like the relations with the place, particularly with original inhabitants. So people forget as well. They forget how this place existed before it was named, and it existed with different groups of people, particularly the indigenous peoples, and they have unique relations to that place. So I'm talking about like how can we so Linda Tuay Smith talks about like how can we rename place using indigenous words, like using indigenous terminology, because there are certain um, words, like I'm sure like we speak as Southeast Asians, that cannot be captured by the English language or any other colonial languages, that just means something, that you mean something, uh, not just to yourselves but to that place where where naming comes from, and or naming of more than humans. So it's like, how can we recapture that naming? But of course, I mean, I'm not arguing that once you rename everything. So for example, once we rename the orangutan Mayas, everybody uses Mayas, it means that it would be conserved. I mean, that's not my argument in the end. It's just sort of how do we respect that the naming that already exists, and how do we change our practices to reflect that naming? Uh, yeah, because I mean, there's also like in Australia, there's in other settler colonial places, there have been movements to change the names, like to indigenous
Yeah.
name. So,
Hmm.
but then also a lot of indigenous activists sort of argue it doesn't change anything. So you changed the
Hmm.
name, but you kept like the old systems. So
Right.
there's actually also a movement for New Zealand to change it to Aotearoa, which I think it's amazing, and I hope that goes. But I guess along with changing the name from New Zealand to Aotearoa, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. It also means like a change of governance, and hopefully, like the Maori are more empowered in that sense, and we need more for Maori governance. So we'll see, because I think with um, all movements to change things, there will always be things that would be, um, what do you call it? Appropriated in many ways, and it always will be. But I think it shouldn't stop. I mean, it doesn't mean that we should give up. Like, for example, decolonization has been appropriated in different ways, where now, like it's become so mainstream, like a buzzword. So what does decolonization mean? It can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So that's why I try to bring it back to like indigenous scholarship, also anti-colonial scholarship, Black scholarship that really draws on this rich anti-colonial ideas to reimagine the world beyond like the current systems that we're in, like capitalism, yeah, and so forth.
Thanks, June. It's wonderful to hear you say that, and I'm sure some of my students are here from I'm teaching. I think I told you about this. I'm teaching this radical Antipodean
I
geographies.
Yes, I
Yeah,
attended your webinar. It was amazing.
right, right. Thank you. And we struggled about that too, especially when we spoke about the naming, for example, and also what it means to be decolonizing the curriculum or the syllabus as opposed to decolonializing. There might be just the same kinds of variations. But it's very interesting too that when you said something that when you draw from indigenous and black and anti-imperialist scholars, anti-hegemonic scholars, where they do most of these works that spark an inspiration in you. I was also tempted when people ask me about it's a tension. I cannot quite get out of this. But
Yeah.
in radical geography, for example, I'm sorry if I'm just hijacking this
No,
moment,
please.
but just to kind of say something like most of the writers I've been asking, I mean, especially Kelvin is in that class as well. we're reading the works of white men, heterosexual white men who are at least 6 foot tall. I mean, it's just that kind of thinking that was prevalent in the late 1960s in Detroit, and later on became a center for Baltimore and many places. And then we struggle with that every meeting and say something like, it's also a way of reflecting that much of the scholarship that has been written about the early forms of radical geography emanated from these spaces, which is not to say they do not have this in other places. So I remember one student saying, well, in the Philippines, we do have some form of radical geography through our own lumad,
Yeah, right. Woman, I've heard of, yeah. Amazing.
yeah, where, yeah, they do. Sarah wrote a picture book about this, Scent of
Oh,
Sun. Sarah Wright, yeah, and it was agroecology, June. Like, it's like a
yes.
way to fight back the system is to do agroecology, a kind of resistance through agroecology. I mean, not the kind of resistance you would expect, which is not to say that other ones are not as effective, but it sparks so many things. What you said, especially too, about recognizing certain kinds of complexity in this whole issue, rather than just saying, Pat, that, oh, coexisting with the Mayas is just one thing, and all that, and everything else will be okay from then on. But still
Yeah.
looking at certain kinds of tensions that may
Yeah, I
arise.
thank you for reminding me about the Lumad. So from what I understand, it actually came from the communities from Mindanao, right?
Right.
And then it also spread into the other islands like in Cebu because but also the state like the wasn't the government
Dispossess them of their
yeah,
land.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, and they also
And,
have schools. I
right. They travel. They have this
yeah,
Bakwit school, which is an English, well, kind of our own version of evacuate, really. And then they go to our university here in UP, where they're taught, or they co-create curriculum, really. It's not like, oh,
yes,
we're
yeah,
UP professors, then we tell you this, and it's the way you should learn things. And I know, for example, that I have a colleague here, who I work with the Lumad, and we told them mapping, in the very first minute, maybe first 5 minutes, we realized that we were almost like unfit to do this, because they have their own cosmology of what cartography means when they do not follow
yeah,
coordinates or cardinal points, and we just have to throw everything out of the window and just let them do their own thing. So um anyway, it's just a tangent, really, but thank you for for somehow making me think about this big questions. But there's this question from a colleague in UP Geography, Dr. Kadag. Do you think there is a real demand from the locals to decolonize, or is it something that decolonial scholars from the university want to do? Good question. Does genuine decolonization need to start at the local level and not from the outsiders like university scholars? Then we go back to the question of who are the locals and who are the outsiders. So it's a kind of
well, I was
self-reflexive.
thinking that Lumad was a good example that it came from the communities rather than
Right.
university scholars. um I think when I think back about just on the practical sense, it when I had to do when I had to do my PhD, but when I was doing my PhD, and I thought about like the different types of ways I could write it and also conduct the research and the methodologies. I just wanted to. It was also a politics of citation, so I wanted to acknowledge all the work that I was inspired by anti-colonial writers, decolonial writers, indigenous, and also Southeast Asian writers, yeah, Sarawakian scholars themselves into my work. So I didn't really want to cite like the usual suspects, like the anthropologists, etc., all the Western scholars. So that was a practical way. So that's when I decided to use decolonial um, methodology for my work. I think this genuine decolonization started at the local level and not from outsiders like university scholars. I think, I mean, definitely from Western academia, I maybe decolonization cannot happen. In Southeast Asia, it's quite interesting because it can also be quite conservative in many ways. Um, I think I mean, for me, I think about, well, I just go back to like Indigenous activists. And I think about, so there's this, he's actually an Indigenous politician from the Philippines. His name escapes me right now. I'm just trying to remember his name. But he talks about like how the elders encourage like himself and other members of the community to go to school and be educated. And, you know, like for the university or whatever you want to do, not so much that you get absorbed into the system, but you get to understand like the ways that the system then you know oppresses like indigenous communities. So I mean, I take that for him. And of course, many indigenous activists, they advocate returning all lands back to native communities as an important material act of decolonization. So I mean through my work, not just as a scholar, but because I also work, I volunteer for the ICCA, which is the Indigenous Communities and Conserved Areas. So we support like the recognition of identities, the ways of lives, the rights of territories and natural resources for Indigenous peoples. So through my work, I mean, to this end, I also aim to ground Indigenous people's knowledge, ways of knowing relationships with land and non-human species by adopting what I call the Indigenous decolonial framework, because I wanted to legitimize Indigenous and other marginalized scholars and my fellow interlocutors as producers of knowledge. So I wanted to put them in, you know, acknowledge like the work that they've done and theorize in their own worlds. But yeah, I mean, I'm also quite skeptical, like you are, about the decolonizing through universities. And I think it's like we always have to question ourselves, you know, like, are we doing the right thing? But I find that there's more scope to explore like certain ideas through like the decolonial framework, and also like other literature. Yeah, by going through this route, because I'm trying to also break away, you know, from established mainstream knowledges, and also recognize that a lot of the work has already been done before me. So I also try to acknowledge like the work of like Malaysians in my work scholarship as well. So you're probably familiar with Alatas. He talks about the lazy native. So that has been a pretty important work of decolonial scholarship for Southeast Asia.
Right. Thank you.
For the locals, I think we're always outsiders. I mean, I talk about a bit about being a local and outsider at the same time. You know, like we got all like these different identities. So even though I'm like Dayu, I'm also like urban and, you know, educated, and you know, so it's there's like various ways of separation that, yeah, my relatives back in the village feel, you know, versus myself. So I also have to acknowledge these tensions. So that's why I try to say I don't speak, I mean, I'm not speaking for Indigenous peoples or scholars or communities. I just speak for myself and what I try to understand. But I'd
Right.
like to hear how he does it, how he works with decolonial methodologies.
Mhm. But I still acknowledge that when you did your positionality early on, when you're in your presentation, is a way of also, you know, it's a kind of a roadmap really of what we will expect coming from your lenses when you look at the Mayas and the Batang even in relation to your engagement with them and also your own engagement to conservation. Um, it's an important step in most of our research as well as actual practice.
Yeah, thank you. Because I remember there was this Fijian feminist who told me once, if you don't explain where you come from or who you are and what's your positionality, how do I know whether I can learn from you? So
Right.
she was in Cambridge for a workshop, and then there was this white guy talking about her island, like Fiji, and she was like, "Who is this guy? How do I know I can learn from him?" Kind of thing. Because he went straight into like his I don't know, frameworks and like case studies, but she didn't know his relations. So actually, in previous talks, when I give this talk, I used to have a slide about my family, like my parents, because then I talk about my own positionality as Indigenous woman from Sarawak. What does it mean? And what identity means to us as Indigenous Sarawakians. But now I've taken it out because it feels so personal and you feel so vulnerable. And people
Mhm.
also don't like it. They're not very comfortable. when you position yourself too much, I think.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
what Indigenous scholars do. They always say, my name is so and so. I come from these lands. I'm from this community. So then you understand, where they're coming from in terms of their research. Because there's no like, there's no such thing as unbiased research, right? Unbiased methodologies. We all come with our own hang-ups and baggage. So I'm
Right.
telling you straight up, these are my hang-ups and baggage through positioning as my identity. Um, so yeah, that's one of the ways that I try to change when I get the talks. Yeah.
I guess there's this also this danger that when, especially when you give a talk such as this to a group of people or students, for example, and then they think of that as the way with which it's done, right?
Yeah,
So
that's great.
they might
That's the idea, Joseph.
but they may also,
Yeah.
yeah, right, they reiterate, or repeat certain kinds of things, thinking that that's the only way to do it. So I guess to encourage them to be also do some critical self-reflexivity and introspection, some inner monologue, I guess. uh, Good word. um Anyway, are there any other questions? We still have about before the next plenary starts in 8 minutes. Are there some questions? We have about 3 more minutes. Okay.
Well,
Any last words, I
my
guess?
last words.
Yeah.
Well, I'm on Twitter, Jane Rubis, so feel free to
Yeah.
connect. If you have any other questions, if you're doing similar kinds of work, I'm really interested to meet other decolonial scholars in Southeast Asia, because I'm curious, what does it mean, decolonial work in Southeast Asia? I really have Joseph, so I've been following your work through the radical geographies. I mean, like the recent webinars. So I'm interested in meeting other fellow Southeast Asians on this, because I think it's a new field in the sense that we could help grow and
Right.
understand
Yeah.
GCAS. Yeah.
One last thing. I just remember before how I sorry again for just to make sure that you understand. I'm not trying to grandstand June's talk, but I remember a professor before who said something about we're learning post-colonial studies, a subaltern, she calls her
Yeah.
class. It's an anthropology class in grad school, June. So she was doing Chakrabarti, all kinds of things.
Oh
And then we thought for someone like me who experienced a subaltern studies for the first time, I thought that was the only thing. And then she, of course, reversed that by saying, "Oh, Joseph, you haven't heard of African, Latin American, and Southeast Asian subaltern studies. That's the one thing you also need to look at." But
yeah.
I'm glad that I'm the gateway for you to open up and look at these things. So I'm really thankful for that anyway, because that's how we learn. That's how we start.
Yeah.
Mistakes, learn from it and then do better, or as Beckett said, fail better so that you could
Feel better.
rise up and do do better. I think um, Hayden Lorimer also said that too, which I kind of use as my Bible in some sense.
I feel
Fail
it.
better.
Don't worry. Don't worry, sweetie. I feel every day.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, imagine when undergraduate students hear that, they don't quite get why they should fail, but another discussion. So
Yeah.
anyway, June, wonderful, wonderful to hear from you. Wonderful critical reflections, and also the questions, especially from Kelvin and Jake, and all the other things that we discussed based on your talk about the Mayas, and also with the Batang Ibans. Um, at this point, I would actually like to uh, give you a certificate of appreciation. There it is.
I
It's
love it.
given to
I
June.
love it.
I know it's gonna
Do
cut.
I have the screen
Oh,
capture to save?
I know. June, by the way, I'm so sorry we didn't have the choral music that we listened to a few weeks back when you gave a talk at PUP.
Oh, that was
So
sweet. That was like the pinnacle of my
I
film
know that was
experience.
beautiful.
I was
That
waiting.
was beautiful.
It was
And I like the I like the way you said it, like you forgot that they do it in Southeast Asia, and all of a sudden I was thinking,
And I
oh, we
was
should
in the
have some choral music,
very,
right? But
very famous.
anyways, certificate of appreciation is given to June Rubis as plenary speaker at the ICGS 2021 Geographies of Care, held virtually on November 4, 2021 at the CSSP UP Diliman, Quezon City, Philippines, signed by our two coordinators for the ICGS, Bernardo Arellano III, Fernan Francis Hermoso, and myself, Chair of the Department of Geography and the President of the PGS, Emmanuel B. Garcia. So thank you very much, June.
Yeah,
And
and exciting.
yeah, yeah, we will definitely be in touch. And if there are some other questions, might be good to also just leave your email in the chat box. That would be probably.
Yeah, I'll do it right now. I just wanted to say as well, I once very seriously considered going to UP Diliman for my post-grad studies. So this is a nice like coming back. Really good
But
school.
Oxford is not bad, right? It's not bad. Anyway, thanks, June. Thank you, June. And yeah, we'll be in touch. So at this point, I may have to give the floor to this is the part I don't know where to go. But the second plenary session is about to start. So maybe I may call on Prof. Oni Martinez. Thanks again, June. Thanks everyone for the questions.
Thank you, everyone.